Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 44, Richard Stark's The Hunter. Hello, Point Blank listeners. My name's Kurt. Joining me, as always, here's Justin. How you doing, Justin?
Good. I'm pretty cozy in my bunker.
This was not the apocalypse that we all had, hoped for. I was hoping for Waterworld myself, Justin, and instead we got Couch World of Quarantine Couch.
Yeah, that's true. I've seen quite a few memes of the expected fashion choices of apocalypse, survivors versus, pajamas and sweatpants and bags of Cheetos on the couch.
What are you
But this is the reality we live in.
Justin, I'm in my house wearing some BDSM gear right now and wielding a club made out of a human skull. What are you talking about?
Well, I'm proud of you. Keep it real.
I'm living my life, Justin. I'm living my life.
Well, I mean, happy quarantine, Kurt. I guess we should celebrate this. It's a rare occasion that we get to be forced into our homes to contemplate who we are and how we want to spend our free time. How are you spending your free time?
Well, I don't feel like I'm utilizing my time as best as I can, but, I've been doing mostly watching things on TV, playing a little bit of computer games. I think I'm over that now, though. I think I need to get productive here. We're recording this episode. Of course, it'll air quite a ways from now. Hopefully we'll all be out of quarantine by then, but who knows?
Don't be surprised.
Yeah, but... we've been working on those quarantine edition episodes, so hopefully you enjoyed those shorts looking at noir films.
Yeah, we looked at the first one we did was Riot and Cell Block 11.
11, yes.
Yeah, that was a fun movie, and it was fun to do a quick little mini episode. We do those every once in a while, but I'm looking forward to more of them as you plan to do a few more given your quarantine.
Yes, as of this recording, I did two more. I did Panic in the Streets, which was really good, and I'm spacing the name of the other one because it's been so long since I watched it, but it's about New York City. I'm sure it's in our feed, so you can take a look at that.
Cool. I look forward to both of those. I have not been watching as many films as I would like, though I do have 2 cinema spotlights for episode 45. It's just been a deluge of responsibilities and confusion with this quarantine. We talk about free time, and a lot of working class folks simply don't have it. So my heart goes out to folks who are on the front lines and doing the hard work that keeps the bourgeois class safe from this impending disaster. But it really speaks to the problems in the society, and pisses me off, frankly. But here we are, and I'll take being locked in my house because, frankly, that's all I ever want to be. My goal to teach is to have summer off so I can sit in my house, record music, read books, and write fiction. And they've just handed that to me on a silver platter. So thanks, COVID-19.
Well, I'm glad you're seeing some benefits out of it. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still grading and having to deal with people management at my job, but doing it from the couch is a little bit different than coming into work after a commute. So, there's an upside to everything.
Well, that's true. And I'm glad you're able to work from home. As of this time, both me and my partner, both her job and my job are currently, we don't know what's going on with them. So it's certainly a time of uncertainty. And, so it's nice to have these books and movies to sort of escape into a little bit until we know what's actually going to happen. So
that's what art is for. Art is for those times when we need something beyond ourselves to help find purpose or just to get away for a little while. And this is a good one.
Yes, yes, it is. It is, and we are today talking about Richard Stark's The Hunter, which was also done as a film by the name of Point Blank, which, might sound familiar to our listeners.
Indeed, and it's a good film. I'll be reviewing that in Cinema Spotlight. A great film, actually, and not just because it's a replicant of the book, but because the artistic flourishes elevate it to another level.
Yeah, so we'll be talking about that actually in episode 45. And today in this episode, we'll be looking at introducing this book. We're going to take a look at a forgotten classic, which in this case, Justin, it truly is a forgotten classic. So we have something to look forward to.
Yay! Was this our first truly forgotten classic?
Yes, I think so. I think you can safely say this is the first one that is really, and I don't think this is going to be forgotten for long. So we'll get to that in Forgotten Classics, and then we'll also, of course, be looking at a biography of Richard Stark, aka Donald E. Westlake. And in our Subject Unknown today, we're going to discuss just in general the idea of crime fiction during disaster times, how that works in the fiction. Do we like that trope or not? And have a little bit of a discussion on that topic since it's relevant to our times.
Absolutely.
So with that, Justin, would you like to start out with a summary of, I want to call it Point Blank, but it's actually The Hunter.
Yes, it is The Hunter, and it wasn't initially The Hunter. I think it was called Payback. So pick your name. It's a Russian roulette of names for this book, but the one we'll go with, the one that's on the front of the cover of the edition that I read, which is the one that was put out by the University of Chicago Press in, I think, 2008 when they brought these books back from the grave. It's called The Hunter by Richard Stark. We all know by now Richard Stark is the alias of Donald E. Westlake, who wrote approximately 3 billion crime fiction books during his time. Under many pseudonyms, Richard Stark was one of his better known ones. This series, I think, stretched for 16 books, and this is the first one. It was originally published by Pocket Books in 1962, and it tells the story of Parker, a professional criminal who was betrayed by an associate, Mal Resnick, and left for dead in a heist gone wrong in California. The problem for Mal is that Parker didn't die like he was expected to. He survived the attempted murder, and after a stint in prison for vagrancy, he escaped prison and made it his priority to find Mal and get revenge. So Parker travels to New York, which is where the story actually starts, and we'll talk about the interesting plot elements in this book, later on in the next episode. But Parker arrives to New York and first visits his wife Lynn, who was part of the heist and who was manipulated or sort of strong-armed by Mal to turn on her at that time husband. He learns, Parker does, that Lynn is shacked up with Mal in the interim, in the wake of Parker's assumed death. He learns that Mal works for, quote-unquote, the Outfit, which is a national crime syndicate. And the job that Mal secured with the Outfit was in part due to the money that he got in the California heist, much of that money belonging to Parker. And Parker wants that money back. For Lynn, after entangling with Lynn, Parker interrogates a courier, a taxi dispatcher named Stegman, and a variety other, a whole sort of other folks as he works his way toward Mal himself, that being his ultimate goal in this novel. Does Parker find the revenge he is seeking? Well, you could assume so, but I'm not going to spoil the ending here. I'm taking a break from spoilers. But I will say that this is a lean, mean, hard-hitting novel. No remorse, no regrets, tons of action, cool, sharp dialogue. It's a pleasure to read. If you want to read a no-nonsense, hard-boiled crime story starring an archetypal antihero, not the kind that has a heart of gold, but one that really doesn't give a shit, one that's really hard to like in a lot of ways. There's no politics, no meandering. This is just punch 'em up action written in clear Hemingway style. This is the book if that's what you're seeking. I said already, is Parker, the heart of gold type? Not really. He's not lovable. And sometimes I struggle to appreciate these sort of ultra-masculine, tough guy anti-heroes who tend toward misogyny. But this story, outside of Parker being who he is a real ripping yarn, I would say. The setup is solid. It dives right in and doesn't let go. And Act 3 alone is worth the price of admission. The tension and the stakes get higher and higher, and the payoff, so to speak, surprises. So this is a classic. It's a classic of the genre. It's classic hard-boiled. You might call it men's adventure fiction or just men's hard-boiled crime fiction, but it's really well done. I give it 4.25 stars. Kurt, I kept that one short. How do you feel about that? Did I cover enough bases for now, or is there anything you want to share?
No, I think you did a nice job with the summary. I mean, it is in a lot of ways. I don't want to call it's by no means a simple novel, but the plot it's pretty straightforward. I mean, that's kind of the beauty of it. I do want to ask you one question, Justin, before I give you my rating. Have you read more Parker novels than this?
I have not. This is the first Parker novel. I've read other Westlake, including one I'm going to review in 5-round bursts, but no is the answer.
The reason I ask is I think I'm going to be in a minority here in the crime fiction hard-boiled community and say that I don't really care for this all that much. There's a lot, and okay, so this is a very... I'm trying to be very careful about what I'm saying here, because there's a lot to love about. I don't know. Do we want to go with Richard Stark or Westlake when we refer to the author here?
I say let's just say Westlake because that's who it is.
Okay. When we're looking at Westlake's writing, there's a lot I appreciate about how he writes this thing. It's that kind of dialogue and narrative storytelling that we enjoy. It's for the most part it's tight and terse, as we've said before. I like the structure, the essentially four act structure of the book. I think that works really well. I like the fact that there's an anti-hero and one who's very much firmly an anti-hero, but there's just something about this I don't care for. I don't feel like I have much investment in this fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is because we've had a long discussion about anti-heroes, you know. We've brought that up numerous times on the show. We've looked at books with anti-heroes as our main character, but there's something missing from Parker that I don't really give a shit about him.
Well, I could see that. I mean, look, I think, and we'll talk about this in depth later, but knowing that this is your opinion, and I'm curious to hear your rating, this will create a pretty riveting, I hope, discussion about Parker as a character, as a protagonist in the next episode when we dive deep. But I too recognize that, and hence my concern about the ultra masculine tough guy, and is he shallow or is he just an asshole? And is that enough for you as a reader? And I think people will have varying answers. In most cases, it's not enough. But I think this is like an exception to the rule for me. But I do.
Yeah, and that's why I asked if you had read other books in the series, because I was sort of like, well, this is the first book in the series, and we've discussed how that can affect a character in a book before. So I guess I'm going to go with a rating here of 3 out of 5 stars for me.
Ooh.
Yes, and I'm totally willing to say that I totally get it. If you love this book and this is a 5-star book for you, I get it. I can see why that would be the case. I just think that there's something really missing for me here, and I do hope to explore that in our main topic coming up in episode 45.
Sounds fair enough to me. That should be a good one.
Moving on, next up we have our Forgotten Classics. And Justin, are you ready for an actual Forgotten Classic here?
I think I am, but maybe I should do a few jumping jacks.
Yes. Do a couple of jumping jacks, maybe some extreme stretching. Can you tie yourself into a pretzel, because that is relevant to this book?
I could, but the hospitals are overloaded right now, and I don't want to add to that.
That's fair. Well, the book I am looking at this time, and here some of our listeners are going to go, of course this is a classic, but I'm looking at the book Nightmare Alley by William Lindsay Gershom. It came out in 1946, and this is in that vein of carnival noir. And now, we've talked about how I have a soft spot for that, but what I didn't do, and I maybe should have done before I gave this review, is I didn't look at the timeline of the other Carnival Noir books that I read, but I think they're probably a response to this book, to Nightmare Alley.
Interesting.
Yeah, first of all, I'm just going to come out and say, yes, this is a forgotten classic. Let me tell you what Time Magazine called this book at one point. It says, Nightmare Alley combines the creepy world of Todd Browning's movie Freaks with relentless cynicism of a Jim Thompson novel.
Ooh,
Yes.
that's a good combo. Have you seen Freaks?
Yes, I have. One of us. One of us.
Okay.
One of us.
Yes, there we go.
I looked at the 2010 printing from New York Review of Books, and it has a nice introduction to sort of set up the book. But let me first tell you a little bit about Gresham, because here's an author, a noir author, who sort of lived a noir life. He was born in Baltimore, and in his biography, you'll see over and over again that he's described as having a tortured mind and a tormented life. And to deal with these issues that he was facing, he sought answers from a variety of sources, including politics, psychiatry, spiritualism, and later on in just other general, sometimes quackery. Early on in his life, he volunteered as a medic for the Republican cause during the Spanish Civil War. During this time, he made friends with a former sideshow worker, and you will see how that friendship shaped his work, because he didn't write a whole lot, but what he did write tended to focus around the carnival and magic and things like that. He comes back from his experience in the Spanish Civil War. He has continued mental health problems. He's described as an abusive alcoholic. He has many, many issues with that. It affects his marriage. He joins Alcoholics Anonymous. It seems like this didn't necessarily work all that well for him, but through AA, he gets interested in spiritualism. By 1962, he's having health problems. He starts to go blind. He's got tongue cancer. And at the age of 53, he checks himself into a motel and kills himself using sleeping pills. Now, his publication history, like I said, is relatively short. In 1946, he publishes Nightmare Alley, which is very well received. He also publishes a novel called Limbo Tower. His nonfiction includes a book about the carnival called Monster Midway, a biography of Houdini, and of all things, The Book of Strength. It's a guide to bodybuilding. Yes.
Awesome.
So let's look at Nightmare Alley a little bit. So this is a noir look into the world of the carnival. This isn't just a murder mystery or a thriller or anything like that. This has a real noir feel to it. There's a lot of things that Gershom did to make this an interesting and unique novel. And when you look into this novel, this is something you'll see quoted a lot of times, but we open with the description of a sideshow geek. And so, Justin, do you know what a sideshow geek is?
Not exactly.
So this is usually the person who would do like very odd, kind of almost like the wild man kind of thing, and maybe would do acts like biting the heads off of chickens and crazy shit like that. And, it was considered like the low rung in the carnival show. Like how would somebody get to the point where that's the performance that they're trying to do to make their buck or whatever. And that's indeed the question that our main character, Stan Carlisle, asks at the beginning of this book. He asks the promoter, well, how does somebody fall so low to becoming a geek? And the sideshow promoter basically says, well, it's not just an act. The geek is made. And then he describes like the downfall of someone and how they become a geek. And this will, of course, come up later. So our main character, Stan, he's a young sideshow performer doing like simple magic tricks, helping out with some of the other acts, but he has dreams of making it big. He hooks up with a aging, and by aging in this book, we mean like 30-year-old mentalist named Xena. She has an alcoholic husband who can no longer perform, but she does sort of the gypsy act where she does cold reading of people and they manipulate the situation so that she can answer the questions of people in the audience, that kind of thing. Well, Stanton helps out with this, and he's learning the tricks from her. In addition to that, he decides to hook up with Xena. Well, during all this part of the story, her husband eventually dies by drinking some wood alcohol instead of regular alcohol, and it leaves Stan to step up and learn this magic, not magic, but this special code that they use to do these reading events. Well, anyway, he gets the code, he learns it, he does a good job, and he hooks up. Now he gets rid of Xena and he hooks up with the much younger, naive, and beautiful Molly Cahill. And they go on the road to vaudeville and start this new, bigger mentalist act that gets, on the marquee everywhere. They're doing big shows all over the place. But Stan is not happy. He wants more. And he gets into the houses, starts getting into the houses of rich people doing these spiritualist acts, mediums and like bringing back the dead and all that kind of thing. Well, he goes on like that for a while, but of course, Stan is the type of person who's never happy. And he ends up going to a psychologist, Lilith Ritter, for assistance. This is only like halfway through the book. She starts to play him, and that's when things start to get really dark. And I will leave it at that and leave it for you to read. I do think, like I said, this is highly recommended, a great noir classic. It's rough and cold noir at its best. And there's a few things here that I like about it. I love the setup, the different acts within this book. I like that the chapters are labeled by the different tarot cards, and they do play a role in what happens in each individual chapter. In 2010, book critic, I think it's Michael Dyrda, said, "I was utterly unprepared for its raw power. It's not often that a novel leaves a weathered and jaded reviewer like myself utterly flattened, but this one did. It's more than just a steamy noir classic. As a portrait of the human condition, Nightmare Alley is a creepy, all too harrowing masterpiece." So, those are pretty strong words about this book. In 1947, it was made into a film of the same name, starring Tyrone Powers, which I've seen that. It's a pretty good film. It's available on YouTube. There was a musical made in 2010, a graphic novel in 2012, and this is why I say this name is going to be pretty well known here pretty soon. There's a remake in the works. It's going to be starring Bradley Cooper and Cate Blanchett.
Fancy people.
Yes, fancy people, big names. It'll be you'll see it in theaters, I'm sure, because at this point it's in late stage pre-production, I guess you would say. So that is Nightmare Alley. I kind of wish we'd done a featured topic on that one, Justin.
Yeah, well, we could down the road. We could look at Carnival Noir. That would be put it on the list. After we do our big reboot at episode 50.
Yeah, it's a possibility, and especially if we time it with the release of the film, that might be an interesting topic.
Indeed.
All right. Well, moving on to Subject Unknown.
Subject unknown.
Unknown. All right, so we're in Subject Unknown today, and we thought we would sort of loosely discuss something timely here. And this is based on a Crime Reads article, just very loosely based on a Crime Reads article called Detecting During Disasters by J. Kingston Pierce. We're not, you can look at find the article if you want. We're not really going to concentrate much on the article at all, but it just made me think about this as a discussion topic. So I don't know, Justin, you have any real initial thoughts about this?
Well, sure. One is that I got my creative writing degree while I was living in Miami, Florida. And so the notion of disasters is something that came up because almost all beginning writers who, cut their teeth in Florida, immediately want to throw a hurricane into the mix. And,
Yeah.
and quite a few do. And in some of those turn out to be very good books. But for me, it's always been like a danger. Like I deliberately need to avoid it because it becomes such a trope. It's so easy, like having the massive boogeyman. It's like the Darth Vader of antagonists. And so it sets up a situation where it's been done over and over again. You need to tread carefully around that. So when we talk about detecting or just crime fiction in general in the context of some kind of disaster, for me, it's like, okay, but how are we going to do it, and how does it translate? And is the writer aware that it's a trope, and how do they deal with that effectively? So I guess that's my caveat when I go into thinking about these things. In terms of like one that's an obvious, well, not a crime fiction per se, but an obvious good book that deals with disaster, it would be Albert Camus' The Plague. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're looking at crime fiction specifically. What were your thoughts on this topic, having read and suggested this article? And are there any particular books about pandemics or disasters that stand out to you that you've read or that catch your eye?
That was one of the tough questions when I was thinking about this, is that, I look back at the books I've read and I'm like, well, okay, if you're using, and I completely agree with you that this is a trope, and it's a potentially dangerous trope for a writer. But I was looking back and I was thinking, well, do I recall works of crime fiction that involve disaster? And I do, but I don't recall any where that's like the featured thing, which I guess is a statement to the success of it. Because if I only remembered whatever it happened to be that was causing this disaster, then that would sort of be a failure of the writer to not concentrate on the crime at hand.
Or the characters,
yeah. And I can definitely think of crime fiction that has, that's a stereotype, right? The mystery takes place during a storm. Everybody's trapped in a house. And that can be a little bit ridiculous. But on the other hand, a storm, and whether that be hurricane, flooding, earthquake, forest fire, any of those natural disasters, I think that works a slightly better, just because it's something that we can all sort of imagine ourselves in, because it is a natural experience. Of course, sure. Now we can all imagine ourselves in a plague situation a little bit better than we could in the past.
Yeah. I'm anticipating a deluge of quarantine themed stories, 99% of which will be terrible. Yeah. But I'm sure we're going to get some quality writing from this experience. However, it's all about the human story. That's what it comes down to. The only way to translate disaster is by telling the story of the individual or the community, and how these individuals, like say for example, a nurse who's working, their third straight night, no sleep, dealing with patients who are infected, but the nurse does not have the right equipment. Yep. They're constantly at risk. There's that psychological torture, and then they go home and like, what's their life like? How are they coping with this? Like those are the kind of stories that intrigue me. Or maybe a pandemic themed murderer who uses coronavirus as their red herring to dispose of a few of their enemies. Something like, there's ways of spinning it, but it has to be on the person and not the, like you said, not the disaster itself, or it's going to fail.
I think you're completely right that we're going to be awash in the pandemic style stories here in the next year. Yeah, but hopefully the good stuff will come to the top, and we will get some good, what you just described to me, a story that really focuses in on, say, people right in the thick of things, the nurse or the EMTs or something like that could be a very good story. So, I'm kind of reminded of that movie I watched, the 1950 film Panic in the Streets, which takes place in New York. And our main protagonist there is actually a doctor who identifies the fact that someone came into port with pneumonic plague, which is the airborne version of bubonic plague, which was the Black Death. And he has to run around New Orleans, and it's all shot on location, which is pretty cool, locating the people who brought this in. And it is a bunch of criminals who were involved in a murder and some other things going on there. And they, of course, refuse to turn themselves in, and there's a chase and all of this. But yeah, I think, when I was thinking about this, it's hard because what comes to mind to me with a lot of these things, especially when they're more human created problems, is that, this is a big thing of adventure fiction, of thriller fiction, of spy fiction, where these big events are unfolding, and our protagonist or whatever has to generally save the day. And those types of stories, first of all, they don't really fit that well into crime fiction, in my opinion, but There are also stories in which when you remove the disaster, there isn't much of a story there. And I think maybe this is a credit to the crime fiction that is I'm thinking about in the back of my head, is that the crime is still interesting regardless of whether or not the disaster is there. You're just using the time and place in the case of something historic, or the disaster just ramps up the tension of the investigation, either creating a tighter timeline in which to solve the case, or external factors which make locating, a killer or whatever more difficult.
Totally. In terms of this particular Crime Reads article, Detecting During Disasters by J. Kingston Pierce, the article itself sort of categorizes different disasters and books within that subgenre: plague, fire, flooding, earthquake, pandemic or bombings, smog, all these types of disasters. Were there any of these books that particularly caught your eye or excited you, or that you've actually read? Because I have a handful that were particularly enticing.
Well, I hadn't read any in that particular list. If you give me why don't you tell me which ones were interesting to you while I bring up that list and have it in front of me?
Totally. Under the category of fire, which to me is a pretty cool disaster scenario, if you have an actual story to tell outside of a flaming inferno. But one of the stories that Kingston Pierce recommends is one that I'd never heard of, and it's the first of the Millet's Holmes novels. Millet being the surname of an author who wrote Sherlock Holmes novels beyond Doyle, and this particular Holmes novel is set in Minnesota in 1894. Up in the pineries, and there is a search for a homicidal arsonist who's been plaguing James Hill's mighty Great Northern Railway. And so there's a lot of frontier elements. There's the Northwoods Pinery thing going on, and the sleuths are up there dealing with loggers and backcountry prostitutes and irritable railroad employees, all in the context of a calamitous inferno. And this, to me, is enticing, me being from the Midwest, and that being an area where I haven't read much literature. I think it'd be a fun way to explore crime in this particular disaster context.
Yeah, that one seemed pretty interesting, and I agree with you that a fire is a good one. Like, whether that be a forest fire or that be like, the Chicago fire or something like that, because I think it also mixes two interesting elements. It mixes the fact that fire is, at its heart, a natural phenomenon, but it's also often a human created one. So you get a little bit of both to it, and also the fact that, so many people describe fire as essentially almost being alive in many ways. So yeah, I think that's a potentially pretty interesting scenario. What was the other one you were interested in?
The other one has to do with earthquake and is related to the San Francisco earthquake and fire of April 1906. So I guess we'll call it earthquake and fire. But there is a story titled Nick Carter's Earthquake Clue, which was published in the New Nick Carter Quarterly in August of that year. And it imagines this dime store detective pursuing a train robbery case in San Francisco just as the first Templars struck. So there's already an established reason they trough to be there. This character's there in pursuit of somebody, and they happen to be in the midst of the beginnings of the infamous earthquake and have to, navigate that situation. I think that's a good setup. You're trying to do something else, but this other thing is interfering with your ability to do it. You're still focused on the case at hand, but that gives you an opportunity as a writer to dive in and explore what that world must have looked like, and that intrigues me.
Yeah, that one also sounds pretty interesting. I'm looking at that list as well now, and I'm not sure that these books I'm about to mention are like going to go to the top of my to be read pile, but I like the concepts behind them, and that's the idea of this one's under the category of flood, and that's Stealing Mona Lisa, and why that's interesting. Well, I guess frequent listeners to the show will recognize the fact that I have a fascination for art crimes and that kind of thing. But I do like the idea of, especially a anti-hero point of view, the thief's point of view, during something like this. What are they going to be doing? How is that going to affect their plans? I know we saw something in our news here under this quarantine. There has been an increase in break-ins, due to all these closed businesses, which have potential valuable things sitting in them without anybody checking on them on a regular basis. That's something that happens, but especially a high crime like this, stealing the Mona Lisa during a flood, that would be interesting fiction to me. And then
Yeah.
the other one, and of course, regular listeners will see why I'm interested in this one as well, but that's during a sinking, the Titanic murders. And that's by Max Allan Collins, and he incorporates some real life history as well into this one. And what intrigues me about this, and this is, of course, historical crime fiction as well, but when you have an event like the Titanic, like not everybody, but most people know what happens at the end, right?
They all make it to New York safely.
That's right. Well, and with something like that happening, you as the reader, and you know that there's an end point to this. You know how it's gonna, how the event is going to turn out. That to me is an interesting way to ramp up the tension for your investigator, because it's an event that's not created by the writer. We know that historical outcome, so it's not in a way the writer doesn't have to do a lot to increase the fiction, because you're going to be sitting there as a reader going, well, it's gonna, the boat's gonna sink here soon. You got to get moving. It's what is it, April 10th? You got to get moving. I think using that, especially when you're writing something set in a very specific historic event, is pretty interesting.
Sure, and a corollary to that is Titanic in the Sky. It's one of their also worth mentioning stories. It's called Flight of Dreams, a novel that came out in 2016 by Ariel Lawhone, and it brings to life the crewmen and passengers, including one bent on revenge, aboard the doomed German Zeppelin Hindenburg. That to me sounds exciting too, because you know how it ends. So how does all that action play out in a way that intrigues and captures your attention, knowing that there's a classic noir doom ending? That could be good. I can't vouch for it. Haven't read it, but it definitely piques my interest.
Yeah, and I think that's true. Is neither of us have had we both had examples of like storms in books, because that's happens all the time. But I really couldn't think of a great example of a book where that I'd read recently anyway, that has this type of disaster, or any of these type of disasters in it. And I guess in a way that makes me want to seek it out and just kind of, at least something that whet that appetite. And I think it's interesting too, just to speak to our current situation, is that it's interesting how, of course, a lot of people are going to want to avoid, if these things are triggering to you, of course, you want to avoid this type of, it's not escapism at that point. It's clear that for many people, fiction like this doesn't have that effect. Netflix recently, during this, the movie Contagion was one of its number one viewings on Netflix. And that's a movie about an airborne illness that originates in small town America. And one of the things that it is passed on by people touching their face. And it's like, well, okay, maybe you wouldn't want to watch that right now. But obviously a lot of people will do that. And a lot of people get a little bit of, that actually comforts some people watching this kind of thing.
Sure. A couple books that come to mind for me, and this is where I'll stop on this topic, of real good stories that happen to, or at least a good story that happens to have a backdrop of disaster, is Shutter Island by Dennis Lehane, which is set in a prison on an island off the northeast coast during in a hurricane's incoming, or a tropical cyclone, whatever. It's a hurricane coming up pretty far north, and adding to the plot, but not being the plot, a key linchpin of the plot itself. I find it to be a great thriller. One novel that I actually read recently, and it didn't even dawn on me that it was about a pandemic, was by Yuri Herrera. It's called The Transmigration of Bodies. And this is on a list of some books about disasters and pandemics, but it's a very short read. Yuri is a well-acclaimed Mexican author or Mexican American, I think of Mexico, but educated in the States. Anyway, Yuri's first book was one of my favorite books of a couple years ago about migration across the U.S.-Mexico border. This book is a actual hard-boiled noir, at least in the way that Yuri writes it, his version of hard-boiled noir or crime, but it's set in a sort of a pandemic, post a pandemic, or during a pandemic when the city is pretty much shut down, and it's sort of like a New York style city, and people are not allowed to go about, but this character has to go out and be the intermediary between two crime families. And while I didn't actually find the book very satisfying, I got it for my birthday and I was super psyched about it. I found it to be disappointing. It does have those themes of hard-boiled and sort of a speculative fiction and also pandemic. And it's like 90 pages, so it's a quick read if you want to get a taste of a more modern literary take on the genre.
Yeah, that sounds kind of interesting. But yeah, I wish I could think of something. I know, in my brain, I know there's stuff I've read that includes this. I just can't recall it right now. And I even looked at my shelves this morning and I just couldn't think of anything, but I know they're out there. And it does, can make a more enjoyable crime fiction story.
So go check out some reads. You can order books online, or you can order them on your Kindle, or they're free at libraries. So take advantage and get some reading done, and make sure you wash your damn hands, folks.
That's right. For our last subject today, we're going to take a look at a biography, just a short biography of Donald Westlake. He is a huge figure in crime fiction, and we're just going to touch on the basics of his life here. Had you read much Westlake before this, Justin? Did you say that earlier?
No, I'm late to this train. I read 1 4 5 round burst for the next episode, but I have not read much Westlake. He's sort of just been on my shelf, or somebody that people say you should read, but I never considered him a first tier. I considered him more like a second tier crime fiction author. And, well, it remains to be seen what I think of him at this point, but I feel like that might be a good place to put him for now.
Yeah,
incredibly prolific.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I've read a couple of things, but not enough to say I really understand Donald Westlake's work. I mean, certainly very prolific, and I do have to admit I have a tendency to dislike authors just from the get-go who have that much of an output, because I do think it affects the work that they do. But I should give him a bigger chance. He was born in 1933. And he died in 2008 on New Year's Eve of a heart attack while on a vacation in Mexico. He turned out over 100 plus novels and nonfiction pieces. He's best known for his crime fiction, both his more hard-boiled Parker novels, as we're exploring in these episodes, but also for comic capers. So he has two major characters that we'll briefly discuss that are almost opposite sides of the crime fiction genre. He also wrote some science fiction and also, under various pseudonyms, some softcore porn novels.
Interesting.
Yes. He is best known for the part Work with Parker, which we're exploring in these episodes. But the other character, which I just mentioned, the more humorous one, was John Dortmunder. And I don't know anything about John Dortmunder, but it might possibly something to explore, because occasionally I do like that comic crime fiction. Westlake was a 3-time Edgar Award winner, and he has the distinction of winning 3 Edgars in 3 different categories. In 1968, he won for Best Novel, God Save the Mark. In 1990, for Best Short Story, Too Many Crooks. And in 1991, for Best Motion Picture Screenplay for the adaptation of Jim Thompson's The Grifters.
Ah.
Yes. And in 1993, he was named as a Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America. Now, when we first started the show, we seemed to be hitting Grand Masters left and right, but I think it's been a little while since we've had a Grand Master on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, not that really means anything here nor there, but it does speak to a life of turning out quality crime fiction. He was originally born back, like I said, in 1933 in Brooklyn to Lillian Bounds and Albert Joseph Westlake. He would spend most of his life basically in and around New York, and a lot of his fiction is also takes place in New York because it's the area that he knew well. He started writing as a teenager. He received over 200 rejections before he made his first sale in 1954. He had attended Champlain College in Plattsburgh, New York. He would also attend Binghamton University in New York, and he spent 2 years in the Air Force. In 1959, he moves to New York City, at first to become a literary agent, but that didn't last very long, and by 1960, he's writing full-time. His first novel comes out, and that is The Mercenaries, and then he would go on to his prolific career. During his life, he'd be married 3 different times, and he wrote under a whole bunch of pseudonyms. And just to pick a few, of course, we have the Richard Stark pseudonym, which the Parker novels were published under. We have Alan Marshall or Alan Marsh, Edwin West, Tucker Coe, and Sam Holt. And then again, there's another probably 15 pseudonyms that you can look up, most of which were used as one-offs or two-offs, or especially for his softcore porn fiction. As a writer, he's known for the integrity of his plots, the audacity of his gimmicks, and his lively dialogue. And I do certainly think we saw nice lively dialogue in this Parker novel that we just read. Much of his work has been adapted to film and TV. I mean, it's a very long list, and I won't read that off for you, but
I would love to share with the readers the books he published in 1960 and 1961 real quick, just to show how prolific he was.
That's a good idea.
Okay. 1960, books published under pseudonyms of Alan Marshall and Edwin West. We have All About Annette, All the Girls Were Wrong. No, All the Girls Were Willing. A Girl Called Honey, The Mercenaries, So Willing, Virgin Summer, The Wife Next Door, Call Me Sinner, Passion's Plaything, Off Limits, Brother and Sister, Campus Doll, Young and Innocent, Killing Time. Those were 60 and 61. The Hunter came out in 1962. He was writing, 10, 15 books?
14.
14. 7 a year.
Yeah.
7 a year.
Although, Justin, I have to say, a lot of those kind of sounded like softcore porn novels to me.
Well, yeah, they sound like garbage, but...
But we did get we did get our novel, The Hunter, shortly after that. So maybe he just kind of needed to work through that, get some junk words out on the page.
Yeah. Exactly, honing his craft.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that Westlake was extremely prolific and kind of ran the gamut of both subject and quality, probably, during his writing career. But luckily for us, as crime fiction readers, that was where he really excelled and left us quite a legacy of pretty good crime fiction. Is there anything else you want to talk about Donald Westlake, Justin?
I was going to say, he's one of these writers, like a throwback to the 30s and 40s, like writers of pulp fiction who, if you're going to make a dollar, make a living doing this kind of thing, which many of the writers that we really appreciate weren't doing because they already had other careers. People like Ross MacDonald and Chandler and Hammond, they had other careers and they moved to writing or did both at the same time. It looks like Westlake went all in with writing and did this all the way through into the modern era, into the times that we were alive. And that, in a sense, he's a throwback, just like Lawrence Block. And they were they were friends, or at least associates, as far as I know.
Yeah.
They co-wrote some books. So I feel like they're sort of peas in the same pod of living that old school, hard-boiled, pulpy lifestyle, which means you're going to get some good stuff. You're going to get some less quality material. But I think, The Hunter is an example of Westlake doing this work at its finest.
Yep, and we will take a deeper look at that next episode, episode 45. Justin, what do we have down the pipeline after episode 45?
Okay, after 45, we go off the rails a little by, we're going to take a trip out to the islands and explore Hawaiian or quote-unquote tiki noir. And while the reason we're doing this is that both Kurt and I have made it to Hawaii in the past 6 months for visits, and we got inspired. We wanted to know more about the crime fiction of the islands. We wanted to avoid, the sort of the beachcomber airport thriller fiction that's, you get a million titles about Hawaii that are written by folks that and that I'm just not going to be particularly intrigued by. We were looking for hard-boiled, we're looking for noir, we're looking for native. Like, what are folks from the islands, how are they writing about the islands in the context of crime fiction? Well, we didn't come up with a particular book that would serve as perfect fodder for our show. So what we're going to do is share with you a medley of shorter reviews, including books such as Repo Shark by Cody Goodfellow and a variety of other reads. So we're not going to actually recommend a book, but by the time you see and hear our episode, you're going to be pretty much filled to the gills with a variety of things that you can go pursue on your own. And then after that, we episodes 48 and 49 are going to be dedicated to Attica Locke's Bluebird, which is a kind of rural noir set in Texas. We're also going to do a featured review of Chris McGinley's Coal Black, which is also rural noir set in Appalachia. So that's what we have in the next 4 episodes, working our way up to 50, at which point we're going to do a little bit of a reboot of the show, and we'll tell you all about that when we know what the hell we're going to be doing.
That's right. When we know what the hell we're going to be doing, we'll let you know. Hopefully that'll be around episode 50. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook at Point Blank, Hardboiled Noir and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Twitter at pointblanknoir. Email is probably the best way to get in touch with us. And don't forget, it really does make a difference if you give us a nice rating on whatever podcast catcher that you use, preferably iTunes for ratings. Until next time, we'll see you. Take care. Wash your hands.
Yeah, be good to each other, folks.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.